When we think about financial meltdowns, our minds usually jump to stories of greed, panic, and these spectacular collapses we see on the news. But what if the real story, the one that truly explains why things fall apart, isn't on the trading floor, but hidden inside the math? We all remember 2008, right? But what if the headlines about greedy bankers and government bailouts, what if they missed the point? What if the fundamental weakness that brought the entire global economy to its knees wasn't really about human error, but a mathematical one?
The story we're all familiar with is, it's a pretty straightforward narrative. It goes something like this. You had these huge bubbles in housing and the stock market. People got greedy. The bubbles popped. Huge banks started to fail. And then governments had to step in with massive bailouts to stop a complete and total collapse. It's a story all about human emotion and big institutions failing.
But there's another story, a much quieter one that financial theorists tell. And they argue that the crisis wasn't just about a few big bad events. No, it was about the math itself, the very probability models that were designed to manage risk, having two catastrophic blind spots.
So this really presents us with two completely different ways of understanding a crisis. On one hand, you have the simple story we all know. But on the other, you've got this much deeper story, one that's rooted in some pretty complex calculations. So on one side, you've got the narrative, a clear, dramatic sequence of events. But on the other, you have the probability story. This is all about the slow accumulation of millions of tiny, random shocks that, according to the laws of math, can sometimes combine to create a massive, totally unexpected event. It's less about villains and heroes and more about how things are secretly connected and what the real odds of a disaster actually are. To really get our heads around this probability mindset, it helps to think about financial markets kind of like the weather.
Yeah, as the Nobel laureate Robert Shiller puts it, the big outcomes we see are the result of countless small, interacting forces. Just like the atmosphere, the economy is incredibly complex. And those simple stories we tell ourselves, they're really just our way of trying to make sense of the chaos after it's already happened.
This analogy is so powerful. Think about it. Meteorologists have these incredibly sophisticated models. They can predict tomorrow's temperature pretty darn well. But forecasting a hurricane's exact path and how strong it's going to be 2 weeks from now, that's almost impossible. Well, financial models are pretty similar. They're good at seeing general trends, but those massive system-shattering storms, they often appear as a complete surprise. So where exactly did the models go wrong? Well, the first major flaw is in a really fundamental assumption they make about how risk is supposed to work. Okay, so the entire modern financial system, and I mean all of it, is built on this really beautiful mathematical idea called the law of large numbers. It's the whole principle behind diversification. If you own just one stock, you've got a ton of risk. But if you own 500 different stocks in all sorts of industries, the individual ups and downs are supposed to cancel each other out, making your whole portfolio much, much safer. And right there, that's the critical question. The entire safety of diversification hinges on that one little word, independent. The models just assume that the fate of a tech stock in California has absolutely nothing to do with a manufacturing company over in Germany. But what happens when that assumption completely and utterly breaks down? This is where a slightly technical-sounding word comes in, covariance. But it's actually pretty simple. It's just a number that measures how two things move in relation to each other. If they are truly independent, their covariance is 0. But if they tend to rise and fall together, their covariance is positive. And boom, this right here reveals the first critical flaw. Because in a panic, everything becomes correlated. Fear just takes over, and investors start selling everything. Stocks, bonds, real estate, all these assets that are supposed to be independent, all of a sudden start moving in the exact same direction, down. The diversification that was supposed to be your safety net, it just vanishes, because the covariance of everything shoots towards 1. So if that first flaw wasn't scary enough, the second one is even more frightening. This one isn't about how things move together, but about the size of the moves themselves. It's about completely underestimating the possibility of the truly impossible. For a long, long time, financial models were based on the normal distribution, the bell curve. And it's a really comforting picture, right? It suggests that most outcomes, like daily stock returns, will all cluster right there around the average. Sure, big swings are possible, but those truly massive, catastrophic events way out in the tails of the curve, well, they're so rare that the models basically consider them impossible. Let's just try to put a number on impossible. On October 19, 1987, the U.S. stock market fell over 20% in a single day. According to that nice, neat bell curve model, the odds of that happening were about 1 in 10 to the power of 71. That's a 1 followed by 71 zeros. It's a number so huge, it's basically meaningless.
But that impossible event happened. It was real. And that single day proved that the bell curve was totally the wrong map for the financial world. The reality was something much, much wilder. And this is the key difference. See, the real world of finance doesn't have the thin, predictable tails of a bell curve. It has fat tails. And in those fat tails, the probability of extreme events is far, far higher than the models ever assumed. That is where the monsters, the market crashes and financial crises, actually live. So how do these two big ideas, covariance and fat tails, actually play out in the real world? Well, we can see it pretty clearly just by comparing the performance of a single company to the entire market. So take a look at the first decade of the 21st century. It was a chaotic time, right? We had the dot-com bust and the 2008 crisis. If you had invested in the S&P 500 index, so the whole market, you actually would have lost money over those 10 years. But if you had invested in just one company, Apple, your money would have multiplied 25 times over. This tells us that risk has two very different parts to it. The first is idiosyncratic risk. It sounds complicated, but it just means risk that is totally specific to one company. For example, back in 2008, a rumor started that Apple's founder Steve Jobs was seriously ill. The market panicked about the company's future, and the stock lost a third of its value in a single month. Now, that risk had nothing to do with the broader economy. It was all about Apple. But the second type is systematic risk. This is the risk that you can't diversify away because it hits everything all at once. The collapse of Lehman Brothers in September 2008, that was a systematic event. It didn't just hurt one company, it triggered a massive panic that sent the entire S&P 500 down 16% that month. This is the big one, the risk that's tied to that rising covariance and those fat-tailed events. So the crucial point is this. The financial models that were supposed to protect us failed because they were just fundamentally flawed. They totally underestimated how interconnected the whole system becomes during a panic, and they completely dismissed the possibility of these extreme, impossible events. To really understand risk today, you have to understand these two hidden mathematical failures. And this leaves us with a pretty unsettling question, doesn't it? We've learned from the failures of the past, sure, but our financial world is constantly changing with new products and new connections we've never seen before. So if the old mathematical maps were so wrong, how confident can we really be in our new ones? What monsters may be hiding in the fat tails of today's market?